Calvin Briggs stepped into the Horizon Lounge at JFK International Airport with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent a lifetime rising above assumptions. The lounge, adorned with velvet seating, golden lighting, and murmured conversation, was a haven for the elite, CEOs, celebrities, and the casually powerful, but Calvin's presence did not immediately turn heads. At 68, his frame was upright, his gait calm and precise, each movement deliberate, not rushed. His face bore the unmistakable lines of time, not just age, but history. His brown leather jacket was scuffed at the elbows, his white polo crisp, his trousers pressed but modest. In his hand, he carried a single, well-worn briefcase that looked like it had traveled far more miles than the people lounging around him. He did not look like wealth. He did not look like power, and perhaps that's why nobody saw it coming. Behind the polished reception desk stood Lena Morates, the lounge's senior attendant, a tall, striking woman in her mid-40s with sharp features and sharper instincts. She had long since mastered the art of reading people in seconds. After 16 years in this lounge, she could spot a billionaire from across the room just by the cut of their coat or the stiffness of their watch band. Calvin, in her eyes, fit none of those signals. When he handed her his boarding pass with a polite nod and a soft-spoken, "Good afternoon," she barely spared him a glance before frowning. "This lounge is for first-class passengers only," she said flatly. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Calvin's expression didn't change. He smiled, gently but without yielding. "Could you double-check that, please?" he asked, his voice calm and patient, but with an undertone of steel. Lena let out a breathy, theatrical sigh, clearly irritated. She scanned the barcode with a practiced flick of the wrist, then stared at the screen, her irritation sharpening into condescension. "Sir, I've been doing this job long enough to recognize a fake when I see one, and this," she said, holding the boarding pass up with 2 fingers like it was contaminated, "is obviously not valid." Then, without warning, she tore it in half. The sound was sharp, sudden, like a snap of judgment echoing across the room. Conversation paused. A young man by the espresso bar turned his phone toward the scene, recording instinctively. Calvin didn't flinch. He stood still, unbothered, his eyes calm as they met Lena's. "Miss Morates," he said evenly. "That ticket was issued directly by Horizon Air's executive office. I encourage you to verify before escalating." But Lena had already made her decision. "If you don't leave now," she snapped, dropping the torn halves onto the counter like trash, "I'll have to call security." And then, a whisper. A single voice, quiet but piercing. "Wait. Did she just rip up the chairman's ticket?" The words rolled across the lounge like a sudden gust of wind through a silent forest. Phones tilted, heads turned. Silence fell heavy and thick. Calvin, composed as ever, reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed. No raised voice, no anger, only precision. "Ben," he said, his voice level. "Yes. Go ahead and make the press announcement. And move." The acquisition timeline up by 24 hours. He ended the call, slid the phone back into his jacket, and looked directly at Lena. His eyes didn't hold malice, just clarity. "You made a judgment based on appearance," he said softly, "but appearances can be misleading." With that, he turned and walked away from the desk. No apology was demanded. None would have mattered. He made his way to a seat near the wide, floor-to-ceiling windows and sat down, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket as if nothing had happened. Outside, jets taxied slowly across the early morning tarmac, their wings catching the light of a rising sun. Inside, the room remained frozen. Lena's face was pale, her lips parted as she stood rooted behind the counter, replaying the moment, in her mind, with growing horror. Calvin didn't move, didn't gloat. He simply watched the horizon. The irony wasn't lost on him. That morning, he had intended to remain anonymous. He had wanted to experience the airline, his airline, as an ordinary traveler, to see with unfiltered eyes what the Horizon brand had become. But the decision had been made for him. There would be no hiding now, not with a dozen cameras, stunned witnesses, and a story that would spread faster than any press release ever could. The night before, in the stillness of his hotel suite, Calvin, had finalized the $1.2 billion acquisition of Horizon Air. No champagne, no press, no boardroom applause, just a simple digital signature, a quiet message to his board, and a private vow to rebuild the company with fairness, decency, and dignity at its core. Calvin Briggs had always believed in actions over headlines. Born in 1955 in Birmingham, Alabama, he had come of age in a world that was stacked against him. He had seen the tail end of segregation, felt the weight of being underestimated, of being dismissed. At 18, he joined the U.S. Air Force, becoming one of the first black pilots in his division. They called him Falcon, a name spoken with quiet reverence after 130 precision-flown combat missions. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for heroism, though he rarely spoke of it. Recognition never mattered to him as much as results. After retiring from military service, he entered the private investment world, never flashy, never loud. Instead, he became a force behind the scenes, quietly supporting veteran-led startups, funding scholarships for underrepresented youth in aviation, and mentoring young pilots who reminded him of himself. The seed for buying Horizon Air had been planted not in a boardroom, but at a charity gala. A retired mechanic from Horizon had leaned over, chuckling bitterly. "Those lounges treat you like royalty until they see your face." Calvin had smiled, nodded politely, and the next morning, he began the process to buy the company. Now, sitting quietly in that very lounge, he was no longer the invisible force. He was the embodiment of what Horizon would soon become, and Lena's actions, the torn ticket, the assumption, the dismissal, had just become the first case study in everything he planned to change. Eventually, his flight was called. He rose with the same quiet dignity he'd carried his whole life, briefcase swinging gently at his side. At gate 22, he handed a replacement boarding pass to the gate agent, who had now been briefed, and boarded without a word. In seat 1A, Calvin settled in. The cabin was hushed, expectant. Amanda, the first-class flight attendant, made her way down the aisle with the beverage cart. Her eyes skimmed over him and then moved on. She poured champagne for the man in 1B, skipped Calvin entirely. Across the aisle, a passenger leaned toward the aisle. "Excuse me," she whispered. "Is he not getting service?" "I'll wait," Calvin said softly. The cabin held its breath. Amanda passed him again. Nothing. A second attendant leaned toward her, whispering, "That's the chairman. He owns Horizon." Amanda froze mid-step. Her face turned crimson. Hands trembling, she glanced back toward Calvin, who simply looked out the window, saying nothing. He didn't need to. The moment had already spoken, and she had already missed it. After takeoff, as the cabin settled into quiet, Calvin reached into his briefcase and pulled out a gold-trimmed envelope, its contents not decorative, but decisive. Inside was Horizon Air's new internal directive, a comprehensive framework for bias awareness, staff accountability, and equity-centered service metrics. He read it not as a formality, but as a commitment, the first step in reshaping a culture that, for too long, had allowed perception to outrank principle. As the flight descended toward Atlanta, Amanda finally approached, eyes downcast, and offered him a glass of water. Calvin accepted it with a simple nod. No words, no resentment, just a quiet reminder that dignity doesn't demand attention, it waits. It doesn't argue for validation, it embodies it. And sometimes, the most powerful statement is silence held with grace. When the aircraft touched down and passengers gathered near the exit, the CEO of Horizon Air stood at the front of the jet bridge waiting for him. "We're ready for your press conference," he said, his voice tinged with both reverence and readiness. Calvin nodded once. "Then let's make this right." In the hours that followed, he addressed the media not with outrage, but with resolve. He outlined sweeping reforms, mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, top-down departmental reviews, and the birth of a new company culture that would no longer tolerate complacency disguised as tradition. Amanda, meanwhile, was placed on administrative leave, but Calvin, true to his philosophy, didn't advocate for punishment alone. He asked that she be offered the chance to lead the very training she had once unknowingly failed to embody, not as an easy way back, but as a path toward personal redemption, the same path Calvin had spent his life quietly offering to others. Months later, long after the headlines had faded, he sat with a group of new hires in a modest conference room, recounting lessons from his time in the cockpit. He spoke not of glory, but of near misses, of discipline, of teamwork, of the kind, of respect that isn't requested but lived. He told them that leadership isn't volume, it's presence. That the real power lies in how you treat someone when no one else is watching. And as the sun dipped low over the Atlanta skyline, a Horizon jet rose into the evening sky, piloted by a crew freshly trained, backed by policies rewritten with purpose. Calvin remained at the terminal window, his gaze calm, unwavering, because he knew that real change doesn't always arrive with applause or noise. Sometimes it walks into a lounge unnoticed. Sometimes it's mistaken for less, and then it waits until justice, sure and steady, finds its gate.